approaching it from one perspective, and we're going to talk about the same text next week from a different perspective. So a little different than most series that I've done. In this one, we're focusing on the same text, but we're coming at it two different ways. Tonight is going to be a little bit more of a technical approach. I hope it's not going to be too technical, but next week is going to be the area-wide youth devotional here at Mablevale, where if you remember last January as well, we had a bunch of teens from Central Arkansas who came and worshiped with us on a Sunday night. So that's happening again. It is next Sunday night, so they're going to be here, and I'm going to deal with the same text next week. But this week, we're going to be a little deeper, a little more technical, since we don't have 100 teens in here, in addition to what we normally have. So that's coming up next week. One other announcement I did want to make, and Ken, it's not working, so you might have to mess around with the mouse. So this is tonight. I wanted to announce this. This is a new teen event that we're doing roughly once a month. And I wanted to announce it because if we do put it on the announcements, I wanted to tell the announcers that we're pronouncing this as blessed, okay? So if you see it, it is just blessed. Like if there were a D there and no brackets, I just did that to be annoying. So if it's on the announcements, that's what you'll say. Also, there are youth group calendars in the foyer. I've gotten all the youth group and youth group parents and all that. I believe all of you have had your calendars now for a little bit. But if anyone else does want a calendar for the youth group, just to have some idea of what's going on, they're on the table in the foyer. So just for your information. All right, tonight, Ezekiel 37. If we're traveling back in time to 599 BC, Ezekiel was not a prophet. He was just a guy living in Jerusalem and working with the priests. But then Babylon attacked and everything changed because Ezekiel was deported from his homeland to Babylon, to the conquering nation, along with 10,000 or so of his fellow countrymen. So they're in Babylon, and as the years pass, they receive news, one after the other, of some other major deportations of Ezekiel's people out of their homeland to the conquering nation. So slowly, bit by bit, his people were being forced into exile. Eventually, about 10 years into his exile, the news came that Ezekiel had been fearing for a long time. Because in all of this craziness, the one thing that they had to hold on to was the presence of their God, represented by his temple. It's hard for us to appreciate just how important the temple was to them, but it represented their connection with their God. It was the center of their culture, and it represented to them everything that they could hold on to, even if everything else was passing away. They could hold on to the temple. But then Ezekiel got the news that Jerusalem, the capital city, had fallen, and the temple itself had been demolished. So at this point, the question is, what does a people that has lost everything do? In the middle of all of that chaos and uprooting and disorientation, Ezekiel is called by God to speak for God to his people. He's called to be what we think of as a prophet. And the book of Ezekiel is a collection of many of Ezekiel's main teachings. If you've ever read through it, you know that, like we said, it's pretty long. It's very confusing for most of us, but it's also fascinating. It's a deep, fascinating book. Many people have even questioned Ezekiel's sanity. If you read through it, he does some really strange things. But it almost takes that to be a prophet. You have to be a little bit different. And Ezekiel was that, and he was exactly what his people needed at the time. Because their exile had shaken them to the core. They were facing these questions, like physically, they're suffering, of course. But also communally, they're wondering, like, who are we now that everything is destroyed? Is there even a we at all? And spiritually, they're doubting, because what kind of God lets his people go through what they are going through? It's in that context that our prophet, Ezekiel, one day finds himself in a trance. He's just sitting in a refugee camp, in the refugee camp of his people in Babylon, just a normal day, when all of a sudden he finds himself not there. Except he is still in the camp, but he's not still in the camp. There really aren't words that easily capture what he's experiencing here. The way that Ezekiel puts it is that he was caught up in God's Spirit. He was brought away by God's breath, by the wind of God. So he's caught up in this trance, and he finds himself deposited in the middle of this vast valley, and there are hills surrounding this valley, and he's just sitting in this valley. Sounds peaceful, right? Doesn't sound like a bad thing to be experiencing. Until you look up and you realize that there are bones everywhere. Literally, the entire valley is covered in bones, specifically human bones, just piles and piles of sun-bleached human bones. There's an entire army that was slaughtered in this valley. It's not a graveyard, at least it wasn't meant to be. It's a battlefield. But it's a battlefield that now, after some great slaughter, has turned into a graveyard. And the bones that Ezekiel's seeing aren't even skeletons, it seems like. They're just bones. In other words, they've been there for so long. They've deteriorated so thoroughly that they're not even together anymore. They don't even look human at this point. So, Ezekiel is led by God through this valley. And everywhere he steps, there are just more and more bones. Twice in this chapter, there's a Hebrew onomatopoeia. And I say that just because it's a really fun word to say, and it makes me sound smart. Onomatopoeia, it's so fun to say. We have them in English as well. It's like the word buzz. So if I say that a bee is buzzing, I'm making the sound that the bee is making, right? Buzz. So onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like the thing that it's describing. So a bee buzzes, literally. That's the sound that it makes. And the same is true here in Ezekiel. It's repeated here a couple times. It's a word that, in the same way that a buzz refers to the sound a bee makes, this word refers to the sound that a fly makes. So the picture is that flies are flying around these carcasses. I know this is not a fun image. I probably should have warned you tonight. It's not going to be necessarily the most fun sermon, but it's in the Bible, so we're going to talk about it. So the flies are buzzing around these bones. This whole scene is dry, dead, and hopeless. That's the scene that is depicted in this chapter. And the key to this text is verse 11. This is kind of what helps us to understand what's going on here. Ezekiel 37, verse 11, God says to Ezekiel, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are indeed cut off." So this is a battlefield graveyard that is covered in Israelite death that Babylon has left in its wake. So those soldiers were Ezekiel's countrymen. And this quote that God has from them, that our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are indeed cut off. In Hebrew, like I said, this is going to be a little bit more technical. I think I'm just about done with the technical stuff, but I think this is pretty interesting. So in Hebrew, those three lines are all 2 words each. Our bones are dried up, and those other 2 lines, 2 words each. And each line ends with the new sound in Hebrew. So in other words, it's a poem of sorts. It's this rhyming, mournful song. It's like, for us, if we're putting it in our context, it's like a poem about death. They're saying in poetic language, we're done. We are dried up. Our hope is gone. And what adds even another layer to this is the honor and shame dynamic that we've talked about before. It's not as big of a deal in our culture, even though it does definitely matter in our culture, but especially in Eastern cultures, it's a huge deal where public honor and public shame is incredibly powerful. And in the wrong hands, it's incredibly dangerous. And that's the case also in the biblical lands, the biblical time. Honor and shame was very important. And one of the severest penalties that you could inflict on someone after their death was to leave them without a proper burial, was just to leave them sitting like these bones. This is a quote from Ashurbanipal. It was a Assyrian king, also another very fun word to say. He was an Assyrian king from around this same time. And he's kind of bragging about what he's done to his enemies. And I think it'll help us to understand the import of these bones. He said, "I took the corpses of the people, and I removed their bones." Remember, Assyrians, not good people. "I removed their bones and piled them up outside. I took their bones to Assyria, thereby condemning their ghosts to restlessness." So what he's done is not only to take out his enemies in life, but he's also cursed them in death, right? So what we're seeing, if we're in this valley with Ezekiel, is a valley full of Israel's dishonorably defeated soldiers who not only lost in life, but they're cursed in death to restlessness. So that is Israel's army. But more than that, these bones represent the nation as a whole, right? That's what God says in verse 11. Because for more than 100 or more than 300 years, the nation had been split into two. On one hand, there are the 10 tribes of Israel. On the other hand, there are the 2 tribes of Judah. So the nation has been divided. And for over 100 years, different parts of the 10 tribes have been exiled. They've been taken away from their homeland. And the 2 tribes are not far behind. So that's coming very soon. So for all intents and purposes, this people group, as a people, is at a very questionable place at best. They are decomposing before their very eyes, and they know it, and that's why they say this. This vision that Ezekiel is experiencing here, this is their metaphor put into his vision. Like he is experiencing their metaphor for their own plight. They are saying, we're dried up, we're dead, we're bones. And here's Ezekiel experiencing what they're saying, they're feeling. It's almost like Jumanji, where you're just playing a board game, and all of a sudden you're in this horrible board game. It's like that, where all of your worst nightmares are coming true at the same time. That's what Ezekiel is feeling for his people. So this vision is a microcosm. It's a very small picture that encapsulates the experience of Ezekiel's people. Their armies are dead. Many of their friends and family are either dead or missing or at least left behind in the homeland where they probably will never see them again. So now, these people are having to start over from scratch in a situation that they never asked for. And all of that puts into stark contrast the question that God asks Ezekiel here. He says, "Son of man, can these bones live again?" Mortal, in other words, can these bones live again? If we're just being honest, no, right? According to everything that we experience, according to everything that our broken world has thrown at us to this point in our lives, according to how life has been going for Ezekiel and for most of us, or really for all of us, no, that's the answer. And Ezekiel is kind of non-committal. He says, God, you know. In other words, don't make me answer that. You know that better than I do. But if we're all being honest, if we're taking off the vision hat, the Christian Ezekiel 37 hat, if someone asks us if bones can live, the answer is no, right? Because that's how the world works. Can these bones live? Well, read with me verses 4 through 8. God says to Ezekiel, "Prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, there was a sound, and behold, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. And I looked, and behold, there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them." So the picture here is striking. It's the reversal of decomposition, right? The bones are coming back together. The skin is coming out of nowhere back onto those bones. This vast army is what they were. Their bodies. But there's still that one problem, that they're not alive yet, right? They're just still lying there, helpless. So it says in verse 8, there was no breath in them. Then God says to Ezekiel, "Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to the breath, Thus says the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army." So God has a message for the deteriorating bones of his people. That worked. Nice. But that's what he says, right? He turns their valley of death into a valley of life. What they needed in the face of all of these shame-giving evil powers of their earth who had taken control of their lives, what they needed was for God to come in and say, no, these are my people, and my people get up. So that's what he does. So this is what happens, or what can happen, when God breathes. He can speak to dead bones and they reassemble. He can speak to those dead bodies, dead reassembled bodies, and they get up. And it all happens because of his breath, his spirit, his wind. Remember that those three words are the same word in Hebrew, and they're all over this text. And it seems to intentionally blur the lines between them, that God's breath is his spirit, and his spirit is the wind. They're blurring the lines because what happens in this text of recreation, where God's bringing back to life what is dead, the wind does what God's Spirit did on page 2 of the Bible, right? Breathing life into the human. Because God's Spirit is his breath, and the breath is the wind, and so on. So there's a mysterious quality to invisible realities like these, right? Because even the word itself is ambiguous. We don't exactly know which one it's referring to. So this concept, or these concepts, don't like to fit into my box, my nice little box that I want to keep God inside of. Because that gives me a sense of security, and it gives me a sense of control over tomorrow, and it helps me to make sense of my world. But this text doesn't just slide into place. It breathes. Now, one thing that we can hold on to, that is true in this story, and it's true at every level of reality, is that without God's wind, God's Spirit, God's breath, there is no life. And that's true of our physical bodies, right? Without breath, you and I cease to exist. And I think it's fascinating that we are permanently and totally reliant on this invisible force over which we have very little control. Like you and I, we need to breathe. We need that. But we don't presume really to understand it or to control it all the way, right? We need it, but we're not in control of it. And the same is true spiritually. Israel in this text is totally dead. There's no CPR. There's no self-help. There's no willpower that can come from their part and to bring them back to life. They needed God to breathe. Now today, you and I are the body of Christ, right? Ephesians 1 and verse 23. The church is Jesus' body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. So together, we form Christ's body here on earth today in this place. That's you and me. And Jesus' body deserves to be nothing but strong and healthy and vibrant, right? That's what we expect and want for the body of Christ. But the fact that we are the body of Christ means that Jesus' body here in this place is not always strong and healthy and vibrant, because we're not, right? Like if we're just putting it in the very context of our church building can be kind of dusty. Like if you're going places no one's been in a while, it's pretty dusty. At night, if you've ever been here at night, you know, creepy, right? Our church building, terrifying at night. Lights on, lights off, doesn't really matter. Terrifying at night. In the daytime too, if you're here alone, it's kind of scary. So church building wise, not always necessarily a picture of health. But also, we know that the church is not the building, the church is the people. So working with people can be frustrating, right? Even with the most lovely of people, working together at sometimes is going to be frustrating. And all of us are not all that lovely, right? Like we can't look each other in the eyes and pretend that we are perfect. So that means that our church is, and our body, Christ's body here in Mableville, it's not always as healthy as we would like it to be. And if we're just going to be really honest with each other, there used to be a lot more people in this room, right? There are a lot of people that you know that were in here that are not in here anymore, whether we're going back a year, 10 years, 50 years. There are a lot of people who aren't here now who used to be. Now, obviously, there are a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of change that's happened. People have moved away. People have passed on. And some people just have fallen out of our community here at Mapleville. So there are a lot of reasons for that. But the longer that you've been here and the more that you've invested into our church, because everyone in here has invested something into our church, but there are a lot of people in here who have invested a lot of their lives into this body of people. So if that's you, then you can pick out probably a whole lot of places in this set of pews where there used to be a face or a head, and now there's not one. So that is true of our experience. Also, in some ways, I'm not going to surprise anyone when I say that we are kind of an older congregation, right? Like if you look around, we have some older people, we have some younger people as well, but we have some older people. I'm not complaining. I absolutely love that. But it does mean that we face very real questions about the future, right? And if I'm expressing something that you've never wondered about, tune me out. But if you have wondered about it, I think we're there together. Like, what does the future look like for us? Is it just that if the people in this room eventually pass on, is that just it for our body of people? And the question is echoing from Ezekiel. Can these bones live again? And again, the answer is no, right? Scientifically speaking, and based on everything in our experience, the answer is no, because bones don't breathe. We know that that's the case. The course of our corrupted creation has instilled in us the belief that death is stronger than life, that the final word is no word at all. It's just the hush of human remains, or the oppressive calm of a corpse, or if we're talking in Ezekiel 37 terms, just the simple silence of sun-bleached bones. It's expressive, but true. But if Jesus taught us anything, he taught us that history doesn't always repeat itself. Or maybe that it does, in a weird way. Because he defied everything that made sense about our world when he got up from his own grave, right? That was not normal. Except it was. Except it was exactly normal for Jesus. Because before it ever even happened, in John 11, 25 and 26, Jesus said, I am, present tense, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? Well, no, Jesus, because it doesn't make sense. Like nothing that you just said right there makes logical sense. If you die, you live. If you believe in me and you live, you'll never die. That is not our experience. And the fact that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, before any of that's even happened, is questionable at best. So it doesn't necessarily make sense, but neither does his getting up from his own grave, right? And that fact changes how we view the world. It's a singular event in human history, and of course it is. But also, it turns out that singular event, Jesus had been saying all along that we get to experience that too. So yes, history did not repeat itself on the day that Jesus got up from his grave. But also, it did. Because all along, he's been saying, I am already the resurrection and the life. Your valley of death can become a valley of life. That's Jesus' message. So, what about our church? I want you to hear me on this. I'm not saying that we are a valley of dry bones in this room. I don't think that, and I'm not trying to say that. But we all have a few skeletons in our closets, right? You do, and I do. Together as a church, we do. When we all come together, we all bring our own little skeletons, and together we have some extra ones. We all have skeletons in our closets. We have scars from living life as a church for almost 90 years now. Almost 90 years our church has existed. And by the way, when I say our church, I'm speaking accommodatively. I know, it's important to express this sometimes. Our church, it's Christ's church. We all know that. But accommodatively speaking, our church. Now, with our church, it's very easy to slip into the mindset that I earned these scars that I have from being a part of this church for however many minutes or years you have been here. It's very easy to think that we got to this point because of my effort, my wisdom, my ideas, my willpower. It goes back to me. But I think into that void, Paul would step, and he says, yes, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And at least sometimes, in my experience, we've tended to stop with that phrase because we do like to emphasize that we play a part in our salvation, right? Because we do. But we also can't ignore the rest of the sentence, which says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is working in us, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So, of course, again, there's this mystery where, of course, we play a part, but also God is the one who's working in us. And we're not going to know the answers to how all of that works. But if we deny it, then I think we're missing out on the perspective that Paul calls us into. A perspective that says, without God's breath in us, we're just as dead as those bones in Ezekiel 37. Because just like those bones, we could all be together in one place. We could have everyone who's ever been in this building together right here, right now. We could have the entire city of Little Rock right here, right now. And we could still be dead. We could just be lying there lifeless, skin on, reassembled, but no breath inside of us. Because we need God to breathe. I'm not going to do it again. But I believe that the message that God has for the deteriorating bones of his people today is the same message he had for the deteriorating bones of Ezekiel 37. It's his breath. It's to breathe into us. What I'm saying is, if we aren't done with him, I don't think God is done with us. It's not that we don't have our problems, because we do. We're not pretending that God is not done with us because of how great we are or how not great we are. It's not about us. But the valley of the shadow of death being transformed into a valley of life never made sense. It didn't make sense for God to bring Israel back from spiritual death. They had been rebellious and corrupt and selfish for generations. It didn't make sense that he stuck by them. It didn't make sense that Jesus got up from his own grave. That's not how life works. It doesn't make sense that Jesus, as Paul says in Ephesians 1, is the fullness of existence, right? Or that we are his fullness, the fullness of him who fills all in all, that he fills all in all, or that we are his fullness. That doesn't necessarily make sense. I know we can parse it out and understand what it means, but just take it for what it says on the surface. It's challenging for our day-to-day reality. But God doesn't always fit into our boxes. And the ultimate and grand and true story of reality and of the Mableville Church of Christ doesn't have to make sense. Because God is looking for partners in our town. And we know that because of what he's told us in the Bible. He's looking for partners here. And you and I, we might not make business sense, but we can be like Rudy. We can get run over in practice every day. If you got that reference, you make me happy. We can get run over in practice every single day, if that's what it takes, right? We can do that. And that doesn't mean that it's going to look exactly like what it looked like in the 1960s or 1980s or 2000s. It might not look exactly like that. After all, after Jesus got up from his tomb, he was still Jesus, but there was something different about him, right? He was still eating and drinking. He was still Jesus, but also some of his disciples didn't recognize him at first, and he could appear in a room that was locked. He could just appear. So there's something different. It's the same, but there's something different. So we can't presume to know that the same programs that worked 50 years ago or even a year ago might work now. We can't assume that we'll have the same kinds of people or the same amount of people. We can't assume that money is on its way, that we're just going to have a Brinks truck back up outside and have so much money to play with. We can't even assume that we're always going to be in this building, right? Doing church the way that we've always done it. We can't assume that. Maybe we will, but also maybe we won't. And that's disconcerting to think about, I think, for a lot of us. But that's what faith calls us into. And the reality that we didn't get ourselves here, of course, I'm not discounting so many hours of work, but so many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hours of work that people in this room have put in. Of course, we put in work, but it's God who's working through us. We didn't get ourselves here. And we're not going to get ourselves to wherever we're going. And that's okay, because the future might not fit into my box, but neither does a valley of decomposed bones getting up and turning into a vast army of the walking dead, right? And I'm not saying, I know you may hear this as my saying that rules don't matter. You might hear me saying that. I'm not saying that. Because Ezekiel 37 is in many ways an expansion of Ezekiel 36, 26 and 27, where God says, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. So life doesn't work without rules, and neither does church, right? It doesn't work without rules. So some of the things that have gotten us here are always going to stay the same. Nobody's questioning that. But one rule that we can hold on to is that you and I need spiritual heart transplants every single day. And that's not comfortable. It's way more comfortable for you and I just to let our old spiritual ticker keep on going, humdrum, monotone, just the daily rhythm that we've fallen into or we can fall into. Never letting God break into our monotony until we eventually just breathe out our last gasp of spiritual life. That's easy. That's comfortable. That's natural. But if we're willing, I think God says to us, my people get up. My people have my breath inside of them. So my prayer for us is that God would breathe, if we can use a metaphor, would breathe into his people. He would shake us into a body that's more. I'm not trying to say that we are this, but in whatever ways we will or have become this, that he would shake us from being just the bones of history or just a group of people that meets in a building that we're keeping just to keep. That he would shake us from being that flatline, monotone, humdrum, spiritual heart beat in this room. And he would breathe in us his life. And that he would resurrect us as the resurrection and the life. That he would give us life in whatever ways we don't have it. That he would resurrect us in whatever ways we're dead. That as the question rings out from Ezekiel 37 of can these bones live? Can the bones in my closet, can the bones in your closet, can the bones in our closet as a church live? God's answer is yes. His people get up. They always do. If they're with him, he's with them. So I hope this has been a message of hope for you. This is a text that gives me hope for the future of my life, of our life together as a body. And I hope that as we step into tomorrow and the next day and extend all the way out to 2024 and go all the way to 2124, that we're walking with Jesus. If you haven't started that walk, right now it's the time to do it. He is the one who gives us life. He's the one who changes all of our valleys of the shadows of death into life. So now is the time to do that if you want to do it as we stand and as we sing.